Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Welcome back, everybody, to a special episode of the History of the Papacy podcast. Today, we are joined by Special Curator Patricia Cecil at the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. And Patricia is here to talk about an exhibit currently running at the National World War I Museum called Sacred Service, which is on military chaplains during World War I. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is a really exciting topic, and maybe we can just start off. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the World War I, National World War I Museum.
Sure. So I'm the specialist curator for faith, religion, and World War I, as you mentioned. So what I do here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial is I look at faith at both the macro, so like the large scale levels, and the micro, the small scale levels. So large scale, I look at how nations used, understood religion, how nations used religion as a tool for war and were both influenced by the teachings and beliefs of religions. That's kind of the macro level. So the large scale relationship between war and religion. And then I look at the small scale. So individual personal experience with faith, religion, and war. So how does conflict affect people's faith? How does it change people's faith? Does it strengthen it? Does it weaken it? And then those individual instances of faith, how do they go on to both change individual lives, but then of the larger world that we live in as well, right? Because one small experience can have huge rippling effects. So I look at that. And then I also look at the enduring impact of faith in World War I on the world that we live in today. So how did things that people were experiencing, how did things that the war changed or sort of kicked off, how are those still influencing the world we live in today?
One of the things that I was really interested in and thought a lot about when thinking about World War I is that the U.S. military kind of came into World War I as not a world-class military necessarily, and then it really rapidly evolved. What was maybe the situation of the chaplaincy before World War I?
Sure. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like the United States went through a massive mobilization in World War I. The military went from about 130,000 people to over 2 million people in the span of about 18 months. So that's a really rapid mobilization. And chaplains were mobilized too. But before World War I, before this huge mobilization and really professionalization of the United States Army, because before World War I, we had never fought really in a large scale global war on foreign shores within 4 foreign nations, right? So this was a really unique moment for us. Before that, the chaplaincy was a little bit scattered. It wasn't professionalized. There wasn't an Army Corps of chaplains. It was really religious leaders who felt called to serve in the military or in battlefield conditions. It was those men who went and joined the chaplaincy. And really, right at that time, before World War I, what we really see is a chaplaincy that's mostly Protestant Christian and Roman Catholic chaplains. And that all changed during World War I.
Just zooming out a little bit and just to set some context, what is a chaplain? And in specifically, what's a chaplain in the context of the United States military?
So a chaplain is a religious leader who serves in a special designated place. So that's why you can have a chaplain in a school, you can have a chaplain in a hospital or in a military, right? It's really that specific institution or place where they're situated that makes them a chaplain. And before World War I, we really had chaplains that weren't professionalized, that didn't really have clear, direct orders from the militaries in which they were participating. They didn't have sort of formalized rules or outlines for their job descriptions. Most of them were really just showing up on the battlefields, joining armies, for example, like in the Civil War, and doing the best they could to serve in those capacities. World War I, with the professionalization of the United States Army, we also get the professionalization of the chaplaincy. And we also see it start to open up to a lot more faiths.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. I wonder, in World War I, what was the training of a chaplain? Because it sounds like that's when it's beginning to become professionalized for the first time. What sort of military training or any training whatsoever did they have?
Sure. So to be a chaplain, and this was across most fighting nations in World War I, not just the United States, but to be a chaplain, you had to be a man. You had to be under 45 years old. You had to have a secondary, so a college education, a college degree, seminary training, so education within your particular faith tradition, and then pastoral experience. So a certain number of years or even months in some people's cases that they could point to where they could show evidence that they had provided pastoral care to communities or groups of people. So those were the main requirements for chaplains in militaries during World War I. And that became the requirements for United States chaplains as well. At the start of the war, to be a United States chaplain, you also had to be a member of either a Protestant Christian or a Roman Catholic or the Roman Catholic Church. With World War I, in October of 1917, the chaplaincy opens up to Jews, Christian Scientists, the members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and other sort of smaller faiths in the United States.
Would these chaplains, were they in the military per se? Were they actual members of the military with rank and all the other accoutrement, you might say, that comes with being in the military?
So some were. Some were already chaplains, for example, with the United States Army down at the Mexican border before the war started. So the United States Army and General John Pershing, who went on to be the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, before World War I, they were down at the U.S.-Mexican border, right? There had been a lot of little uprisings and things in the Southwest. So they were down there and they had chaplains with them. For example, Dr. James Naismith, the inventor of basketball, was a chaplain down there with Pershing and the forces. And there were other military chaplains who were previously in the United States military. But when the U.S. enters the war, just as we see a lot of young men enlisting to serve in the military and registering for the draft, we also get a lot of clergy who want to respond to the needs of service members and enlist as chaplains to be there to assist in the war effort. And a lot of these men, the training that they received, they had a lot of educational training, so a lot of training in their religious teachings, a solid college education. But what they didn't have, most of them, was military training. So those men who were with the Army before, the military before, were a small group. Most of the chaplains who were coming into World War I were as just unprepared, for the war as most of the soldiers that were enlisting as well. So, they weren't used to living, what we think of like an Army lifestyle. They were used to preaching to congregations on Sundays and preparing their sermons and meeting the needs of their community members. So it's a completely different environment in which they are thrust into when they join the military. And a fair number of chaplains are sent to the Army Chaplain Training School at Camp Zachary Taylor in Kentucky. And an interesting fact about this school, it's actually the first desegregated space in the U.S. military. So during World War I, African American and white soldiers were segregated, but not at the U.S. Chaplain School. So African American chaplains and white chaplains learned how to be military chaplains together. And that site actually outpaced the overall desegregation of the U.S. military by 17 by 30 years. The U.S. military was desegregated in 48, and the chaplain school was desegregated in 1917. It's actually desegregated from its inception. It was integrated from its inception. And chaplains they're getting your army training, right? They're getting sort of your basic military training, but they're also learning what they're going to have to do as chaplains in the field. So how do you minister to service members in the unique environment of a battle?
And it's interesting you bring up segregation and integration. Back in the 19 teens, even Roman Catholicism was a little bit of a stretch for a lot of people, let alone all the other religions that would have been needed, like you said, the Latter-day Saints. And I mean, even I'm sure there was Muslim people and certainly Jewish people. How did that work out? Because it's sort of like if the army is letting these people in or letting in all these other religions, they're pretty much putting their stamp of approval on that. How did that? What was the politics of that? And what did people in the military and in the administration think about that?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. Like it's a completely different environment, the United States in 1917 than the one in which we live in today, right? In 2024. And these were really novel and honestly, offensive to some people, like these concepts, right? You mentioned that Roman Catholicism was a stretch for a lot of people. So was Judaism, right? All these faiths, because really what we saw is so that traditional concept of what makes an American, which pre-World War I included being a Protestant Christian, that falls away with World War I. So, in the decades leading up to World War I, we had so much immigration in the United States from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Ireland. So we were getting a large population of Roman Catholics. We're getting a large population of Jews. We're also getting new religious movements in the United States, right? Like Pentecostalism starts in 1901. We're getting all these sort of new things that people are not familiar with their concept of what is an American. And what we see with World War I is the idea of what is an American doesn't contract, it expands. So just as you mentioned, the military is a microcosm of our society. So we have all these different immigrants, all these different ethnicities, all these different faiths coming together. Well, we need them all to fight in World War I. So what do we have to do? We have to embrace them, and we have to embrace them for their diverse ethnicities, for their diverse faiths, especially if we want to win the war. So what we see emerging out of World War I is the concept that an American religiosity, or what your specific religion is, no longer has such a huge percentage emphasis on your Americanness, right? What it means to be an American is now, do you believe in the Constitution? Are you patriotic? Will you fight for liberty? The concept of Protestant Christianity really falls away. And that happens because it's actively embraced by leadership. So Bishop Charles Brent, who was a personal friend of General Pershing's, he was an Episcopal bishop, and Pershing asked him to sort of step in and run the U.S. chaplaincy. And Brent could have taken the title of Chief of Chaplains of the American Expeditionary Forces, but he didn't. He put in a three-man commission with himself as lead, and he made sure it was interdenominational because one of Brent's life's work was sort of giving birth almost to the ecumenical movement of the 20th century. He was a really big believer, and I'm going to paraphrase it, sort of this idea of many paths, one way. So there could be many different religious denominations and religious faiths, but it should all ultimately, right, like lead to one concept of God or faith, right, of one shared humanity. And that's really the important thing for Brent. So Brent really fosters, as sort of the first head of the American chaplaincy, right? He's tone from the top. He sets that tone right away that Americans we are a multi-faith nation, and the chaplaincy should be a multi-faith chaplaincy as well.
How did that really work in the nuts and bolts of on the ground? Were chaplains, and I wonder if this, and maybe you can get to discuss how this has changed. Was a chaplain assigned to a unit? Were they assigned to a brigade? Like, how exactly did that play out?
So chaplains were assigned to units. They tried, it wasn't guaranteed that you were going to get a chaplain of your faith, right? You could be, like, let's say, a Jewish man from New York City, and you become part of the Fighting 69th. Well, the Fighting 69th, their chaplain is Father Francis Duffy, and he's a Roman Catholic. And about 90% of the other members of your unit are either first or second generation Irish Americans, and they're practicing Roman Catholics, right? And you're sort of, and this really happened in the 69th. There were many Jews in that division. So you weren't necessarily guaranteed to get a chaplain of your faith in your unit. But another thing that Brent and the chaplaincy in the United States was very adamant about was that all chaplains, even if you weren't the faith of that soldier, you could still minister to that soldier. So you had some sort of basic training in their beliefs. And actually, it sort of happened really organically a lot of times overseas. Is chaplains themselves would get together, say a Jewish chaplain, a Roman Catholic chaplain, and a Protestant chaplain, or a Latter-day Saints chaplain. There were only 3 of those, though, so they were more fewer and far between. But they would often get together and say, okay, well, if someone, let's say a Jewish person is dying on the battlefield, what are the proper prayers that you say to help this person, right? A Roman Catholic priest isn't going to give them last rites. He wants to know the prayer that he's supposed to say to honor, in this faith, this person's death, to prepare them for death. So a lot of chaplains got together and ensured that they knew what the proper rituals or practices were for different faiths. And as the war went on, and as the chaplaincy expanded and grew, more and more chaplains themselves, from these different faiths, came in to meet those needs. You also had a lot of non-governmental organizations, so organizations like the Jewish Welfare Board, the Knights of Columbus, the Salvation Army, the YMCA, who provided their own chaplains. So they weren't inside the military apparatus. They sort of they were chaplains, but they were volunteer chaplains that would then be, say, like assigned to a unit. There were American chaplains with the YMCA and other entities that actually were then sent to, say, French units and things and served. So there was a huge volunteer apparatus of chaplains as well that stepped up to support service members across different faiths and nations.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. Now, I would have to imagine, for the most part, this worked pretty well. It sounds like for the most of the people wanted to work together. They wanted, I can't think of who said it. There's no atheists in the foxhole. Like, I'm sure most people wanted comfort, and it didn't really matter, what they had on their lapel. Is there specific examples of where a chaplain helped somebody who was of a different faith and, there was a good outcome?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sure.
There are so many tales of interfaith cooperation from World War I. One of the most famous is actually a French story. There's a Rabbi, Abraham Bloch, who this became widely publicized. They made prayer cards. The media on this story was really big because it became kind of one of the emblematic interfaith stories of the war. Rabbi Abraham Bloch was with a French unit. He came across a Roman Catholic service member who was dying in no man's land. And the service member had one last request, and that was that he was able to hold a crucifix while he died. Bloch went and found him a crucifix, brought it back to him, was handing it to the man, and a shell exploded, killing Bloch and the man together. And there was a reporter nearby who recorded all the events, so that's why it became more widely known. But it was printed in numerous French periodicals. Many people ended up printing prayer cards with an image of Rabbi Bloch on it and the story on the back and a prayer. So that really became a huge, a widely spread tale of Jewish and Catholic cooperation, right? It's this idea of these two, because there were significant Jewish populations in France, as well as the large Roman Catholic population. So this was a tale of these two faiths, the common goals of these faiths, which really became a refrain that was played over and over again in the war. It's like, maybe, yes, there were differences between Christianity and Judaism, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, but we're all working together here. There's this idea in the Allies that's like, we really know what this means. The Germans may be Protestant, they're in Lutherans and Christians, but they don't really get it, right? Like the core, like we understand what it means to cooperate as people of faith during suffering. So that really became a huge strain during the war for French, and then Americans and the British really took on that story as well. There are numerous other stories of cooperation. Rabbi Lee Levinger was an American Jewish chaplain who served overseas, and he has an excellent memoir. I believe it's An American Jewish Rabbi in France. That may be the name. Very similar to that. But Rabbi Lee Levinger, and he has numerous accounts of interfaith cooperation between chaplains, and then also between service members. There's one quote that they talk about having a Rosh Hashanah, a service for Rosh Hashanah that was given by an Episcopalian priest in a YMCA hut with cigarettes furnished by the Knights of Columbus. So it is just like this. That's just one sort of snippet of those efforts, and those sort of things were going on all the time.
And I have to ask, for the flip side, then, were there examples of people being closed-minded or not holding to the highest ideals of what it sounds like they were really trying to do? I would imagine there are examples of the opposite as well.
And there are, like Lee Levinger points out in his memoir, he talks about with Jewish service members that sometimes the chaplain's job was to protect the service members, quote, from the real tyrants, the line officers, like the real tyrants and oppressors, the line officers. So there was certainly anti-Semitism that service members suffered. There was certainly racism for African-American service members, no questions whatsoever. And there was also, people came with their prejudices, with their bigotry to the war, just as many came with their hopes for a future and their desire to help others, right? It is sort of that eternal human sword, right? That cuts both ways. And for as many people as there were trying to help others, there were also those who did not have, who did not act with the best of intentions and were outright, harmful to others. So there are definitely those instances. Although I will say, in doing research for this chaplains exhibit, the stories of cooperation and helpfulness and a desire to ease the suffering of others, those stories were much more present. I found them much more readily than stories of oppression or hatred. It really did, from what I've read. It sounds like most people, this was a horrible war. People were suffering, and most people were just trying to help other people who were on their side for the large part.
I'm getting to your point about how the chaplains were in a way protecting from the line officers. And that is sort of a thing of a person of the cloth, is to look out for the interests of the common person. Chaplains, were they in the chain of command as such? And did they play an advocacy role for the troops versus commanders or that sort of thing, for the general welfare of the people, you might say, the actual line soldier?
So chaplains had this really unique role in the military where, and you sort of discovered it, they could move with much greater ease than most other people within, right, that rigid military structure of hierarchy and rank. Chaplains in the United States military were automatically officers. If you enlisted or came in as a chaplain, you received the rank of lieutenant. So you were an officer, so you could fraternize with officers, you counseled officers, you were there, but you were also there most frequently with those everyday service members who were struggling to understand even why they were there or just get through the day, just survive. So they had this unique identity where they could move amongst people much more easily than so even a higher ranking person within the military. And often, yes, that's what they did, was they were the advocates for your regular Joe who was serving in the military, whether he was suffering mental anguish, whether he needed to write a letter home. Chaplains were the people there who were helping. And most service members didn't have anyone else to turn to during those points. I always like to remind people at this point in time, mental health services were pretty much non-existent. You had to be really far gone to, be sent somewhere like a sanitary, somewhere like that. If you were just someone who was even, suffering from some pretty serious PTSD, you didn't have anyone to talk to or to help you through that experience unless you found your way to a chaplain. And the chaplains were the boots on the ground mental health services during World War I. They were the people who could help you write a letter, home. There were many men who didn't know how to write, and there were chaplains who were teaching men how to write, how to read. They were writing for men when they couldn't hold a pen or a pencil. They were counseling them through, ethical dilemmas of war. They were counseling people who had gone through, traumatic events that it's hard for us to even fathom in 2024 in the United States. And chaplains were the ones who were counseling these men through these moments. And it was really, they were the singular people that stepped up and were the helpers. And that's kind of something I stepped away with in working on this project that I hadn't really thought of or realized before. But right, most chaplains were non-combatants, unless you were in France. In France, chaplains and priests were armed and you had to fight. Everywhere else, a chaplain was a non-combatant. So these are the people who are there to help. You're just that you're in this melee, in this chaos, and you're there as a helper. And you're also there as a person who sees that service member, not as just a cog in the machine of war, but you see that person as someone, right, with human dignity and worth who is suffering and needs help.
So a chaplain would literally have to fight in France, a rabbi or a Catholic priest, you name it. They would literally fight in the trenches?
Yes. So in the decades leading up to World War I, there were numerous secular and reform laws passed in France to lessen the amount of influence the Roman Catholic Church had in France. So it was really a push to make it a much more secular society than previously. And so part of that was France required conscriptions for priests. And they got rid of the law that said priests and religious don't have to fight or join the army. So there were about 22 to 35,000 Roman Catholic priests that fought with the army in France that were armed. And of course, right, these men were fully soldiers and fully priests. Just because they joined the army, it didn't mean that they weren't priests anymore. So they still fulfilled their duties, their priestly duties, while fighting as soldiers. And chaplains were armed as well. If you encountered an enemy, it was expected in France that you would fight and kill if necessary. That was the only country where that was the case.
And you mentioned that at least one chaplain was killed in action. As a percentage or in raw numbers, do you know how many chaplains were killed in action?
Not totals all over, not for all countries all over the war. But for example, like in Great Britain, I believe it's around 148 or so, don't quote me exactly, of chaplains that died. It's normally around, and I think in the US, it's around the 200 mark. And there were about 2,000 chaplains in the entire United States military. So I feel like often it's about 10% roughly that suffered, that died, were killed in action or died.
That's
fair
quite
number,
a
right?
bit.
Yeah. So you think about it, they are, they're at the whim of all the danger, the everything else that all the service members are in danger of as well. So are chaplains, right? Like, you're in the trenches, you could get hit by an artillery shell or a sniper bullet. Like, you have just as much chance as the guy standing next to you of being shot or killed. At the beginning of the war, most officers requested or ordered chaplains to stay in the rear. Most officers thought that chaplains belonged in field hospitals to minister to the wounded. But very quickly, especially in France, Roman Catholic priests refused to listen to their officers and went right over the top with the men. They said that it was literally their duty, their calling, to not abandon the men in their hour of need. So they would just go right over into no man's land, into the battle with service members, because they felt that that was the moment at which they were most needed, where they may have to perform last rites or be there to get someone out of harm's way, or to, so they really refused to follow officers' orders. And by, September 1914 in France, we have all sorts of accounts of Roman Catholic priests being right with soldiers, going over the top. And that really sets the tone for all other chaplains who then come into the war. And we see this development of chaplains just being adamant that they had to go over the top with their men.
And I guess really in the grand scope of things, historically speaking, that's not that bizarre. I mean, in the 30 Years' War, there was bishops leading armies and fighting each other. And maybe there was a little bit of a lull after that. But well before that, in the Middle Ages, it wasn't out of the question for a bishop. I mean, they even had rules that bishops couldn't carry swords. They had to carry clubs. And
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. But so I guess that's not, it seems like, I guess in our modern context, that seems very bizarre. But maybe in the overall scheme of things, has that changed? Is that pretty much the standard now? Or in the post-World War I period, do chaplains, are they armed? Are they expected in some degree to participate in military activities?
To my knowledge, across almost all nations, chaplains are non-combatants now. They don't take part in fighting. They're just there to counsel and support service members.
On the front line, it would be maybe that your chaplain was Jewish and the people were Roman Catholics, or vice versa. Did they have opportunities, the soldiers, to engage with a chaplain who was of their particular religion or denomination at special times, or times that you really couldn't have somebody of another faith fill in?
Yes. So there were lots of efforts made to move men to a chaplain when a chaplain wasn't there for the men. So, for example, like in the American Expeditionary Forces, for Jewish service members, for services on high holy days like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, they would have for like a service, and if it was possible, they would bring in men from different units and bring them all together for say a Yom Kippur service, if it's possible. They did that in the German army and the Austro-Hungarian army as well, just because percentage-wise, the percentage of Jewish service members was much lower than Christian service members. So a lot of times, especially in the German army, they would sort of like get them all together and then take them over to the Rosh Hashanah service here, and then you could go back to your unit. So people did have, like, say, special dispensations to, go to another town for your service here or there. So they really did make religious accommodations as best they could when they could.
Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon. Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors. Maybe we can switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about even before we get to that, maybe tell us a little bit about the museum itself. I haven't had a chance to visit. What maybe makes the World War I museum unique?
Oh, sure. So we are America's museum dedicated to remembering and interpreting the Great War. So, we tell not just the United States story of the war, but we also tell the global story of the war. We are in Kansas City, Missouri. I get a big question all the time is, why are you in Kansas City? Why are you not in Washington, D.C.? And that's because the people of Kansas City raised $2 million in 2 weeks after the war ended to build a memorial. And it was built and dedicated by 1926. So by the time the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression ensued, we already had a big memorial built, which was sooner than most other municipalities in the United States. The stock market crash and the Great Depression really sort of killed most of those other projects, but we raised a lot of money and did it quickly and had it built pretty fast. So we had the memorial, and then by 2006, Congress declared it the nation's memorial to World War I. And we've also been collecting since 1921. So we have the most extensive material culture collection related to World War I in the world. Most of our collection is American focused just because we are the National Museum for America, but we do have an international focus. We do collect things from all over the world, but we have been collecting since 1921. So we've been at it a really long time and have a very robust collection. So, we help America understand World War I, but we also help America understand the enduring impact of World War I, because much of the current climate that we're living in, the globe that we live in, even the maps that we look at, they all come directly from World War I. There's so much that happened in that span of really 5 years that built the world that we're living in today. So that's part of what we do at the National World War I Museum and Memorial too, is we explore the enduring impact of World War I.
And what was the genesis, you might say, of having a special exhibit about the chaplaincy and chaplains during World War I?
So it is one of our goals right now at the National World War I Museum and Memorial to explore the lesser known stories of World War I. We just had the centennial of World War I from 2014 to 2018. And during that time, there was a lot of scholarship and programming and things revived about the war. And it really looked at, what was your average soldier's life like? What are the lessons that we can learn from World War I? And it really touched, what we talked about a lot was sort of those stories that we're all really familiar with. The World War I nurse, the AEF doughboy. But what we realized after the centennial was what we really hadn't explored, and honestly what history hadn't really explored for the last 100 years, was those lesser known stories. So what does it look like for a person of faith to be in war, right? What does it look like for a person, from the Hopi Nation to go to war, right? Like, what are these stories that history has largely ignored up to this point? And how can we tell them and in turn understand and get a really more true representation of what World War I was like and the people who lived through that war and how their experiences built the world we live in now? And it was, there were so many people that were involved in World War I. When empires went to war, they brought their colonies with them. So you had populations from North Africa, from India, from Japan, from East Africa. It truly was the first global war. So diving into these perspectives has been our focus for the last couple of years. And sacred service, looking at the experience of chaplains, right? It is one of those ways that we're looking at those lesser known stories.
And how do you put together something like this? Because you're telling a story. Are you looking just in your own back room for artifacts? Are you going out to different religious organizations? Or how do you get these artifacts to tell the story you want to tell?
So it's a years long process, right? There's the foundational research just about the topic, but then there's finding the material culture. So what do we have that can help tell this story? What has survived? And so we turned to our collection here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, which is extensive, especially relating to American chaplains, but also those chaplains I talked about that were with those non-governmental organizations. So the Jewish Welfare Board, the Knights of Columbus. We have a really rich collection from those groups. And then also it was reaching out to institutional partners. So we're really fortunate that there's the Army Chaplain Corps Museum, right? So there's a museum solely for chaplains. When I found that out, I rejoiced. So that was great. So I reached out to them and they had a wealth of material. I mean, they had a complete United States chaplain uniform from World War I. So we have that on loan from them on display in the exhibit. And we reached out to institutional partners too, like the Musée de la Grande Gare, the National Library of Austria, and others, telling them that we want to share this story with the public and seeing if they had any collection materials that they would be willing to loan us. And we have quite a few loans in the exhibition. We were really fortunate to have a lot of institutional partners that wanted to work with us and help us tell this story. So we have objects from not just our wonderful collection, but all over the world. And then there's, of course, finding the things that no one knew about, which is reaching out to private collectors, reaching out to people who work within the area of World War I and material culture and seeing what's out there that maybe no one else knows about and adding it to our collection or receiving it for loan for the exhibition. And we were very fortunate in that there were a lot of people that really wanted to help us tell this wonderful story.
I wonder if there's some artifacts in doing this much research and doing this sort of exhibition. Are there a few artifacts that really stick out to you that really tell a really powerful story?
Yeah, one of my favorites is on loan to us from Brigham Young University. It's a burial notebook that belonged to Chaplain Calvin Smith. And Chaplain Calvin Smith was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he was one of 3 Latter-day Saints chaplains in the entire war, right? Latin in it itself is pretty singular, one of 3 people in the war. And his burial notebook is really unique because he was a missionary to Germany before the war. So he had been to Germany, he had lived in Germany, he spoke the German language. So when he went overseas as a chaplain, he buried both American service members and German service members, right? Because one of a chaplain's duties is to identify bodies after the battles. They would go and they'd identify the bodies. They'd conduct the burial and memorial services. And then they would also write letters home to surviving family members. And so Chaplain Smith and many chaplains buried both U.S. or regardless of their nation. They buried service members of different nations, but Chaplain Smith is unique because he also recorded those German burials in his notebook. So in his notebook, we have both American service member burial details and German service member burial details. And Chaplain Smith, because he was an LDS chaplain, he didn't receive the training that most other chaplains received. So going to that school at Zachary Taylor, because there was such a need for Latter-day Saints chaplains in the war, he went straight to a regular training camp and then was sent right overseas. So he didn't receive the normal chaplain training. So at the end of the war, he packed up all of his things and he sent them home to his wife in Utah. If he had received the normal chaplain training, he would know that he wasn't supposed to do that. And anything with sensitive information like his burial notebook, etc., he was supposed to pack up and send back to the United States Army. But Chaplain Smith did not send it to his wife. So fortunately for us, unlike all other U.S. chaplain burial notebooks, which were destroyed in the interwar years by the United States Army, Chaplain Smith's burial notebook survived. So we have maybe the only surviving U.S. chaplain burial notebook on display in the exhibit. And it also tells, this really beautiful story of this Latter-day Saints chaplain and his effort, to bury both German and U.S. service members. And his notebook was actually used by the German army after the war to repatriate German bodies back to Germany for proper burial. So it's kind of really this beautiful story. So I love that object, and I'm so grateful to BYU that we were able to have it in the exhibition. So it's a really singular piece. We have quite a few others. I just love the pull chain rosaries. People may be familiar with them, but they're called pull chain rosaries because they look like the chains on old lamps that you would pull, like the pull cord, those metal, almost like ball bearing kind of looking things. But they were designed at the outset of World War I because they were specifically designed to be rugged, to be portable, to be able to be carried with service members. So we have an instance of one of those near our Daughters of Isabella, the little section where we talk about the Daughters of Isabella and their rosary drives that they organized for service members. We also have Father Duffy's, who had the chaplain for the 69th Division that I mentioned earlier. He kind of became one of the most famous chaplains of World War I. He has a statue in Times Square, and Warner Brothers made a movie about him in 1939. But we have his confessional stole from World War I on display in the exhibit on loan to us from the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps Museum. So that's very special just because Father Duffy was such a charismatic, incredible person. And then to have that piece that he wore when so many of those men in World War I were participating in the sacrament of reconciliation, I find it really profound and beautiful. And I'm very grateful that we're able to share it with everyone.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Were there a lot of stories, and was it accepted for chaplains on either side to provide comfort to soldiers from the other side?
There were certainly for prisoners of war. We have lots of stories of that. We have stories of chaplains, advocating and even writing services in foreign languages, like services in German for German service members who were prisoners of war, like prisoners of England or other countries. So there certainly were chaplains that went above and beyond for prisoners of war. But I don't know. I didn't come across any stories of chaplains, like, let's say, going all the way through no man's land to the other side and ministering to people. I didn't come across any narratives like that. But there's certainly, when there were prisoners of war, chaplains were there to help. And we also have instances of chaplains. We have one German chaplain who wrote all the time. We have pages and pages of his diary recordings, and he writes about how moved he is by the suffering of the Belgian people, and actually how deeply offended and saddened he is by the actions of his German soldiers that he's serving with, right? He's writing about how he's sort of taken aback and understands. He even writes in his diary, he understands why the world hates them so much. It's kind of this really incredible thing for this man who's part of this army to say, but he writes about witnessing, the starving of Belgian children and women, and just, it's very hard for him to reconcile his personal morality and ethics with the larger sort of war machine that he is a part of.
I think that's one of the most fascinating things of thinking about this with chaplains is people have a lot of contradictions and conflicts as it is, but they're in a conflict situation where they're literally in the military, but then they have this higher calling. And it seems like there's so many different ways that could play out. I think that that's one of the reasons why I would love to learn more about this. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity to speak with you. If somebody, hopefully when people go to visit your museum, what should they expect to see when they go into the actual exhibit?
So they're going to see first a lot of, at the very first part of the exhibit, we sort of set the stage for what the cultural climate was in different countries, especially surrounding religion and the war, right? The landscape, the cultural landscape of 1914 is much different than the one we live in 2024. Most people, by modern day accounts, would have been considered devout. So there was a lot more religious symbolism and imagery and allegories that were used to contextualize the war and also motivate people to go to war or justify the war. So people will get a really solid understanding of, the socio-religious climate at the time. They'll also walk away with a greater understanding of who chaplains were, there are 18 different biographical panels throughout the exhibit. And those endeavor to tell the personal stories of chaplains. So a diversity of chaplains from different nations, different faiths, and how they experienced the war, right? So for everyone from Rabbi Elkin Vorsanger from the United States, who is known as the Fighting Rabbi, to Bishop Charles Brent, to Reverend Robert Ryder, who is a Methodist minister from the UK, to German Pastor Siegfried Egelbrecht, who was a Lutheran pastor in Germany. So they'll get really specific personal narratives of chaplain experience in the war. And then they'll also see the material culture. They'll see chaplains' uniforms. So we have a Roman Catholic French chaplain's uniform. We have American Expeditionary Forces chaplain's uniforms. And then we also have religious objects, right? Those sacred objects the chaplains used during worship services. So many of them carried portable field communion kits, so they could perform communion or celebrate the Eucharist anywhere. So we have a number of those. We have vestments of chaplains. We have portable altar kits. We also have the material culture of the people who were behind the chaplains, helping them and supporting them. So some of those groups I talked about earlier, like the Jewish Welfare Board, the Knights of Columbus, the National Catholic War Council, the Salvation Army, right? So all of those materials that they were printing and distributing to people, all those fundraising efforts that they underwent. And then we have, right, the objects of chaplains themselves, from uniforms to medals that they received, to Bibles, to gifts that they gave people. So people will hopefully walk away with an understanding of what was going on religiously around the war, but then also they'll walk away with hopefully a deep appreciation for the actions of chaplains and how chaplains themselves were personally affected by the war. I really want to challenge people to think about the role of faith in adversity with this exhibition.
If people want to learn more, or even if they can't make it to Kansas City while the exhibition is still going on, how can they learn more about this great exhibition and possibly plan a trip there, or if not, in some way engage with your museum and exhibit?
So they can visit us online at theworldwar.org. There is a landing page for the exhibit, which actually has quite a bit of information. We've been undergoing a 3D or digital scanning initiative with the chaplain exhibit. So there are quite a few on that landing page, 3D scans of like a chaplain's tunic and other objects. So people can zoom in, they can rotate, they can really closely examine these objects without having to be actually in the physical exhibit space. A couple of those are on that landing page. And then in September of this year, we're going to be launching a companion digital exhibition to sacred service. And that is going to be comprised of 10 to 11 of those 3D scans. So people are going to be able to manipulate them to really get a close look at this material culture, and then also have, that those contextualizing information around it. So that'll be available in September. Otherwise, the exhibition will be open to the public, and it is included in a general admission ticket to the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and it will be open until September of 2025.
Well, that's awesome. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'll put links to all of the websites and everything that you mentioned in the show notes. Thank you again. And do you plan, as one more question, do you plan to do more exhibits like this that involve faith and the war?
Yes. Yeah. So there's a digital exhibition. There are actually 2 digital exhibitions that I've done previously on our website. One is Fighting with Faith, and that was about the first mosque built on German soil, which was for Muslim prisoners of war during World War I. That's a digital exhibition that's on our website. And then also Charmed Soldiers, which is a digital exhibition that looks at the small personal items of faith, hope, and luck that service members carried during the war. So those are 2 exhibits that I've already done about faith and religion. But yeah, there will be more to come.
I would like to send a very special thanks out to our latest patrons on patreon.com/history of the papacy. At the Alexandria level, we have Brad, and joining us on the Antioch level is Emmett. Thank you so much, Brad and Emmett, for choosing to support the history of the papacy. Hey, before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the papacy diptychs. At the Alexandria level, we have Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Judy, Max, and Brad. At the Constantinople level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
Deus